Welcome to Aspire, and I Have the Right To podcast, where we amplify voices, share stories, and drive change in the fight against sexual assault. We explore the critical issues surrounding student safety, institutional accountability, and survivor empowerment. In every episode, our goal is to provide insightful conversations with survivors, experts, educators, and advocates, giving you, our listener, valuable information, resources, and actionable steps to create safer environments and cultivate the culture of respect and consent. Welcome back to the I Have the Right To Aspire podcast. I am Alex Prout, co-founder of I Have the Right To, and I am joined by my co-host and daughter, Lucy Prout. Lucy is a PhD student at New York University Silver School of Social Work and a circle keeper with the Restorative Approaches to Intimate Violence Project. Aspire was created by the nonprofit I Have the Right To as a space for honest, meaningful conversations about survivor advocacy, prevention, and what it truly takes to create safer communities. This podcast is about learning together, leaning into courage, and uplifting the voices of people who show up every day to drive real, lasting change.
Thank you so much. And I'm so excited to co-host for the first time with my dad, Alex Prout. But before we jump into our conversation with our wonderful guest today, we want to take a moment and introduce our two co-hosts. I Have the Right To interns for the summer. Ryan, Sylvie, would you like to introduce yourselves?
Hi, I'm Sylvie. I'm an intern here.
Hi, I'm Ryan, and I'm so excited for this podcast.
Amazing. And our wonderful interns have been working hard all summer, helping with our curriculum, with research and development. And they're especially interested in the aspirational masculinity work at I Have the Right To.
Wonderful. Well, today our guest is Gary Barker, founder and CEO of Equimundo Center for Masculinities and Social Justice, one of the world's leading organizations working at the intersection of gender equality, masculinity, and social justice. For more than 2 decades, Gary has led groundbreaking global research on the lives of boys and men, helping shape how we think about masculinity, care, connection, and fatherhood. He is also the co-founder of Men Care, a global campaign promoting engaged fatherhood in over 70 countries, and Men Engage, a worldwide alliance of more than 1,000 organizations working with men and boys to advance gender justice. His work has influenced policy and public conversations around the world, and his recent TED Talk challenges us to rethink masculinity through empathy and care rather than dominance. Gary, having had the pleasure of, working side by side with you for a number of years at Vital Voices, and more recently, seeing you in action with Equimundo, I can't tell you, how honored I am to have you on our podcast. And I'm looking forward to our conversation today.
Thanks for having me. And I, back at you in terms of just admiring the courage of all of the family and beyond and how you're speaking out on this issue and leaning into aspirational masculinity as part of the solution. So excited to be part of the conversation. Thanks for having me.
Yes. And, what I'm really excited about, Gary, is, getting into a conversation with someone that has really walked the walk. I think, we see, I don't know if trending is the right word, but there's a lot more conversation and thinking going on around now about the state of men, the state of boys, men's mental health, the impact on gender-based violence, et cetera. But one of the real pleasures of spending time with you recently in California and learning about, your advocacy background and the roots from which you came from, it really helped me sort of understand. But, I'd love for you to share with our audience, Gary, that, you've been doing this work for multiple, decades. What first drew you to this work? And how did your time living in Latin America shape your understanding of masculinity?
Yeah, thanks for that. I think like many people in the field, I had, personal family experiences that said, what is this about? What is men's violence and what can we do about it? My father was a social worker. I have two adopted siblings. We were a foster home for lots of children that came sometimes a month, sometimes 6 years. Almost always there was a story of a man's neglect or abuse, and probably at, younger ages than we might like, or that I might have, thought was a normal thing. It was part of our dinner table conversation. And so, coming out of a household that a sense of service and support to those who had experienced violence or neglect was the normal. That was the default in our household. Um, Along those years, I also witnessed a school shooting in my high school in Houston, Texas. A young man killing another in a kind of, I don't know what you'd want to call it, a kind of perverted honor killing. He announced in front of our school cafeteria that the other boy had stolen his girlfriend as if women are property, and he was going to make him pay, and he killed him in front of about 100 of us. Very little conversation about what happened, about the drivers of it, about how we felt about it, about what it meant to witness an act of violence like that. And then a year later at my university in Texas, there was an incident of basically group sexual assault on a Friday evening in the dorm. And our university did nothing except for after that, students had to register their guests. There was no further discussion, no actions that any of us knew about. So just this kind of what do we do about cycles of violence? In the first part of my career, and that's the part that takes me to Latin America, I worked with refugee children in Central America, and then with gang-involved and conflict-affected young people in Colombia, and then girls, particularly, who had been sexually exploited or involved in sexual exploitation or survivors of sexual violence, first in Colombia and then in Brazil. And in a lot of that work, we were obviously focused on how do we empower survivors, but we also started to ask, how do we look upstream? And it was in that work in Brazil that I kept looking at not every man at the bar who has the buddy who was paying for sex with underage girls seems to be supporting this. And certainly not all, whether it was the sailors who were coming in at the port area or Brazilian men, certainly not all those men thought that was okay. And we began conversations about how can men resist? And I think that was sort of an obvious but necessary question of saying, it is not all men who believe the same thing about violence and sexual exploitation. And the fact that even in settings where it's quite normalized, there are always men who question it. And I think that helps us step in with more than just we're going to arrest men who carry it out, which I believe we must do. But it gave us a pathway to say, how do we find men in this cultural setting, in whatever cultural setting, who oppose these versions of manhood? Most of the men who were where these acts took place didn't speak up. And I think and I know you work on that as well, of how do we support men to say, I know this is not right. This is not something I support or agree with. How do I step in and speak up in ways that can break cycles? So that was the beginning of just asking that question. How do men resist? What are the pathways to men's use of violence? And how can we use that research to say there are evidence-based approaches that we can develop that engage men to call out for good? And I think from a political framing, that's also important as well. I don't believe in the kind of simplistic, not all men pushback, but it is also important to say, not all men. And then that is the beginning of a conversation to say, well, if the men who do not believe in this, do not support it, do not condone it, why are we staying in silence? And what do we need to do to get men to stand up and speak up and act in appropriate ways? So that's been a question that I guess has been a 25-year-old question that we're still at, and I know you are too, of how do we get the good men, the average men, the men who know this is not okay, to step out of silence and make their voices heard, together with the women who have been making noise on this for decades before we even called it out.
So, Gary, that is, so critical, so important. And, I know as you mentioned firsthand, how hard it is to change, attitudes that are so deeply ingrained. But I also chuckled a bit because hearing 25 years, and I think of our co-hosts on the podcast, who are in ninth or 10th grade in high school. And I'd love to pivot to you guys to sort of, respond or comment to what Gary said. And I might put it in two different ways. Ryan, I want to start with you. When Gary talks about, you know, um, the silence that exists when, questionable behavior, is happening, and breaking that silence and having the courage to speak up. What is your reaction to that? Have you been in situations where you've seen things that have been uncomfortable and you've had to make that active, sort of thought process? Do I remain silent? Do I speak up? And, what are your thoughts, on that?
So, first of all, the one thing that I want to talk about, and this is like such a reoccurring thing that I see everywhere, it's although like my thoughts on this are I agree. I feel like so many people are silenced when they shouldn't be. And I feel like the main reason is because strong, like the traditional meaning of strong, means not showing your emotions. Like aspirational masculine, like being masculine means being like an alpha. Like you don't show any emotions. You don't do anything to any self care. And I feel like one of the most important things to changing that. And although this isn't something that's going to happen in 10 days, in a week, it's redefining what strong truly means.
Yeah.
And I feel like I've been in many situations, like I was recently at a camp, and it opens up your eyes to see how so many people are carrying silent battles. And when you all come into one space and you change what strong truly means and you redefine the meaning of strong and you show that strong means being vulnerable and talking about your problems, then that's what causes people to speak up. People are waiting for somebody to start a conversation about their problems, about what's going on in their lives. And when somebody does, then it goes to a huge rabbit hole of people truly caring about like their feelings.
Yeah. Yeah, Ryan, I appreciate that. And I do think, that tough guy masculinity is also around like part of why you don't question the other guy, right? Like if he's that guy walking around as the tough guy, the one that we're supposed to fear, or he might have threatened us at some point, right? I mean, the number of I'm guessing you have, but I remember like the currency of what you would do to, push someone down was, call them gay or other words that we sort of put them in their place. And, you're supposed to take it in silence, right? Or it was meant to silence you. And I think it is part of that, right? Of kind of, we don't show that either we were affected by that, either the harm we saw, that comment made to us, and just this silence around manhood in general, that you're not supposed to ask about it, question it, call out the tough guy. Um, yeah, I think it's, and thank you for bringing that up.
Mhm. And one thing just to add to that, I feel like all the stuff that puts other people down, it's not a one-on-one experience. It's such a universal experience. And once
Yeah.
again, everybody's just waiting for one person to speak up. And then everybody just starts like talking about what happened to them. And I feel like one of the biggest parts about like, oh, that big tough guy, like you have to take it yourself, is by taking away that person's platform, that so many other people that you'll be able to tell are going to come and they're going to support you and they're going to agree with you. Because although like it might be scary in the moment, I feel like everybody's been through similar experiences. If there's just like that one cool tough guy or something like that, and everybody wants the same thing you do, and I feel like it's so important when you do speak up about it.
Yeah. Agreed.
Wonderful. And Sylvie, you go to a co-ed, high school in Seattle, Washington. How has your experience been with this? And have you seen examples where someone has shown, to me, it really is leadership skills, that I think is really what you're talking about, Ryan. And I'm so, proud that you can see that, so crystal, clear. And also being caring enough to want to set up a safe or supportive environment where people, can speak up. But Sylvia, have you had experience with this, and what has been your thoughts when you've been through through it, whether it's been a positive or a negative experience?
I've noticed this a lot at my school, just with the kind of pressure of silence as you were discussing earlier. And I think that the most important thing you can do is break that silence, even if it's in a small way. If one person says "Oh, I don't know about that," you don't have to attack the other person or come for their values, but you can just bring up a little bit of question and kind of put that pressure on them to know that they're being watched, and that they're in a group setting. That kind of brings together a community that's more willing to um, look for those lack of values and look for those predatory behaviors and kind of watch out for them.
Yeah.
I love that example, Sylvie, because I think what you're sort of touching on is that there's so many different types of ways of speaking up and supporting survivors and transforming environments. And it doesn't have to necessarily look like, running to the center of the room, like screaming and saying, "Stop right now."
Yeah.
There's so many different ways to take action and to stand up. But something that you all touched on, and it brought up a question for me, is around that aspect of speaking up. And I think back to my experience when I was in high school and when my sister was assaulted, and it felt like no one was speaking up. It felt like everyone was silent. And I was graduating from school. I was on to college and leaving that environment. And so one of the threads throughout my career and now my research are those factors of, what helps, builds that sense of courage, whether it's institutionally, individually, structurally. And so from the myriad of different experiences we have on this call, Gary, Dad, Ryan, Sylvie, what would help you speak up, or what do you think would help people speak up?
I mean, I think I think Sylvie touched on this, and the importance to know I'm not doing this alone. I mean, there are instances where it's one brave voice, really shifts the whole thing, but most of it requires multiple voices, and to know that somebody has got your back when you decide to say this is not okay, right? And that's how the walls of silence work in you know private schools, workplaces, sports teams, right? Where, don't talk badly about our boys. They can't have done any wrong. And it is really tough when there's those kinds of power dynamics to be the single voice. But if it's, hey, and that's the power behind in Toronto Burke with coining Me Too, which was others saying, hey, you are not alone in this. So one is it's not being alone in that specific space of I add my voice to say this is not okay. I'm watching too. Or it's the political cause of saying this has happened to lots of us. It is not the shame of the survivor. It's the shame on the perpetrator. So I think one of the things we have to do with young men and men sometimes is kind of, it's not you to be this lone wolf hero. It is, how do you speak out with others? You're not speaking out instead of women who are ready to speak out on this. You're speaking with them. You're not speaking out kind of, I'm the one who, raised his hand and said this and called the other guy out. It is about, how do we do it appropriately? How do we do it together? And particularly when there's, power involved. There's always power involved. But when the power dimensions are really big, right, where there's an institution that's trying to put up a wall, it really is, we love films that show the single voice that spoke out, but anybody in this field will tell you the importance of someone else behind them backing it. And it only became a movement, and it only was effective when others joined in. So I think it's that idea. We got to sort of break that Hollywood savior complex out of our head and think of what we do together.
I think another thing to just add on to what you're saying is that if you know a survivor in your immediate circle, it's really important that standing up for them doesn't come at the cost of their privacy. So you have to make sure that you're coming up with ways to stand up for them in ways that aren't putting them in the middle or putting them in the spotlight. We have to think about their needs.
And for me, one thing that always helps me speak up is the domino effect. Like when you think about it, the experiences that you're going through, or let's say you're being bullied, by standing up, although in the moment it may seem like something's wrong, it may seem like this is you're alone, but almost always there's a domino effect of other people doing the same. And even if you might not see it, it's so important to know that just you speaking up could change somebody's life fully in ways you might not know. And I feel like that's something that always empowers me to speak when I think something is wrong. It's that other people might think the same thing as me. And if they don't want to voice it, I'll be their voice and I'll always be able to speak for them.
Well, and I think one of the sort of key things, and Gary, I really respect and love how, consistently you have focused on one specific word, which is care. And, you know, if, and it's such a beautiful word, right? Because it has so many different connotations or meanings. And but also it has to me a fundamental simpleness to it, that if we could just boil this down, because every answer I've heard from everyone is the foundation is caring.
Yeah.
And I'd love for you to talk about your work in terms of how to unlock that, especially in men,
Yeah.
because the concept of self-care or caring for others for men is not well focused on, developed, whatever you might see it. But if we think about underpinning everything that everyone has talked about, care is so essential and important. It isn't difficult to understand why we have the issues and trouble that we're facing, whether it's men's mental health, gender-based violence, all kinds of, issues in between.
Yeah. And I think that the reason we've leaned into care is a lot, the same reason that you all are leaning into aspirational masculinity. I think so much of this work, and it needed to start there, has been about calling men out for harm and calling out the harm in manhood. And obviously we need to, but the kind of, to say violence prevention doesn't say, what are you filling in that space with? And I think as we thought about what is the end goal of our work, we of course want relationships where men don't use violence or coercion. No one does. But we also want to say, well, what do we fill that in with? What is the positive the positive qualities that we want in men? And every time we named them, they felt kind of clunky, right? We'd say healthy or equitable or respectful, all good adjectives, but they really feel like, like just specialists and experts like us use them. So as we thought about, what also prevent, so as we looked at men who had been exposed to violence growing up, they witnessed it at home, themselves experienced it, and didn't go on to use it, almost always they could point to someone who cared enough to break the cycle and said, I care how you experience that violence. I don't want you to go through that again. And they weren't really saying it out loud, but they also wanted to say, I care that you don't repeat it and do the same thing that fill in the blank your father did, your stepfather did, another man around you did. And so as we listened to kind of what felt like the word that worked in multiple languages, it was this affirmation of care. And I think, Alex, you touched on just how many ways it works. It's a good, all-purpose verb in lots of languages. So self-care, that we are thoughtful enough to acknowledge when we're going over the edge and our own mental health or our own trauma that we've experienced is leading us down a path of harm and self-harm. So that's one form of it. Can I consider emotional self-care that I need? Care that I provide to others so that I'm part of ending cycles of violence. I care about their well-being. I care about the spaces I'm in. And then it also works quite well as we think about care for those in our household, whether you're a father or all men have some caring relationships. And when all breaks down, I remember, also thinking about work that I did with perpetrators of violence early on in my career. And the one time I could get, almost all of them would go in with kind of a thick armor of, I'm unjustly accused here. And what we could get them to kind of put that armor down was if we asked them about their relationship with their children or others around them that they perceived they lost a valuable relationship. So it was getting them to tap in to the fact that they cared deeply about someone. It might not be that partner they harmed, but there was somebody that they were ashamed and cared deeply what they thought about them and also cared about them, that felt like it was the thread that pulled us out. It helped us pull men out of cycles of perpetration. And it also feels like we give men something to aspire to. So we're, and Lucy, you got a chance to see the event we just did in Brazil, which was a test of what if we do a public facing event where we kind of talk about manhood, but not really. We talk about men and care, and we talk about it across workplaces and religious leaders and indigenous leaders and rap singers and dancers, and we have some art stuff going on. And we just kind of put those two words together, or three, men, boys, and care, and see what happens. And I think I came away from that convinced that it's got some street cred. We're going to keep leaning into that. It does feel like it takes us on a path where men get to be better. They're not defensive. They find what kind of gives them meaning in the first place. We just haven't allowed them to say it.
Absolutely. And I just, you bringing up that time in Rio instantly brings me back to the Men Care Changemakers Summit, and just thinking about, for me, it was the first time I had been at a conference, been in a space that really felt joyful when we're talking about these issues. And like you said, there was dancing, there was singing, there were people getting to know each other. And it just felt so healing in a way, where it was one of the first spaces that I've been in as a woman. And I was actually probably in the minority of people working, along these issues, trying to end gender-based violence. The session was packed, and it was probably majority men there. And there were high school kids there too, which was beautiful. And they were raising their hands, asking questions, and you could feel the momentum building and growing. And to me, it felt like a healing experience, seeing that all coalesce together. So I also want to, share my appreciation and thanks for creating this convening on a global level, and the power that the phrase care, holds to bring folks from different spheres, different sectors, different walks of life, all around to the table to celebrate and really make change and take action together.
Yeah. I think I'm guessing, like me, Alex and Lucy, you've probably been to lots of events in the space we work in, right? Of ending cycles of violence, supporting survivors. And it is heavy, important, sober stuff that we have to treat with that gravity. But I think what we hear from survivors as well is this is not the only thing that describes who I am. And so I think both for affirming for survivors that we will give you the joy back that was taken from you because of this, and that as we engage men in conversations about prevention, we believe in your best. We believe of who you are on your best day, of who you were, I would say even evolutionary, that we as humans, we can be provoked and we are wired to cause harm, but we are equally, and I believe more wired to care and provide empathy. And so I think leaning into that provides an opportunity where we have the heavy conversations that we must have, but with this affirmation that, that we believe the best of manhood and of humanity, and women as well, is the care and connection that we have for each other, not simply what we must do to break cycles of violence. Sorry, I want to say this in a different way. And that is one of the ways that we get to breaking cycles of violence, is that affirmation of the connection and care between us, which is so, just brutally broken when acts of violence are carried out, particularly in cases of sexual assault and in cases of gender-based violence.
As you're speaking about expression and learning what's quote unquote acceptable for young men to feel, from all the research that you've done and from all the interviews, at what age do you begin to see boys really internalize those expectations? And what do you think are the biggest influences on them when they have to internalize the expectations?
Wow. Yeah, that's a big, long question. We know that, babies begin to distinguish the stuff that we consider gender, of what is masculine and feminine, from a year and a half to 2 years old. So these ideas about male and female, start showing up then. We see, what happens to 3-year-old boys who feel allowed to show emotional expression when they go off to childcare and they're with, and there's kind of masculine, sometimes fun, but sometimes also kind of pecking order styles of manhood show up. And boys start to feel like they can't really show their true selves, or the other boy will call him, "You're a girl," or other words, but typically kind of starts there. So, I think from the moment of, as we develop a more complex view of people around us, we are always taking these ideas in. And so I think parent training is one of the things that we do because it's so important for parents, and teacher training as well, and work with daycare workers around how do you present ideas about male and female that are based in equality, that are not about, kind of being these little police that walk around and say, don't do that and don't do this, but that are just thoughtful about how do we question that? Why can't a boy do that? Why can't a girl do that? Have you seen boys who do that or seen girls who do that? How do we step into that with a gentle conversation very early? And then it's got to keep on. I think occasionally we'll have a funder who will ask, tell us what age that can we do an educational intervention at age whatever, and can you guarantee it will work? And say, no, it's not like a vaccine. It's like nutrition, right? You gotta eat well today, you gotta eat well tomorrow, eat well the next day, skip a meal, but then catch up the day after that. So, I think to think of this as sort of lifelong learning around how we learn to be, good humans, and the role of all of us, right, to create these spaces where it's not just parents, it's not just teachers, but all of us kind of in those spaces of how can we nudge toward caring, connected manhood, and kind of put a damper on the harmful versions around us. So I'm kind of a start early and keep doing it is would be my take on it.
It is fascinating, Gary, because, we had Jonathan Jacobs on the podcast earlier, and we got into a fascinating conversation about, the way he phrases it, redefining American manhood,
Yeah.
which I love that phraseology. But as we were getting into the conversation and hearing you speak now, I can't help but think that the problem lies with us, meaning men of a certain age and up, because we are the role models. We are shaping the conversations that are in the air that our young people are breathing and setting
Yeah.
the standards. And and our work, with young people gives me extreme hope about the future. But then, this is such an unusual, circumstance, because my hope is that the young people can continue with who they are, right? Versus us. When you referred to the work, like a vaccine, I almost feel I immediately went to, our society infecting them
Yeah.
with
Yeah.
with these with these versions of, masculinity, or anyway, versions of who you're expected to be versus who you are. And and that is, I mean, I don't really understand how to react to that situation, because, the work is really, on our shoulders to fix and address, so we're not weighing down young people. Does that make any sense? Any
Yeah.
sense
I
to
mean,
you?
um, I definitely believe, we talk about this much more today. We talk much more about trauma, right? If we understand what drives men's violence against women, men's violence against other men, boys' violence against others, there's so much that is learned in trauma. It is a reaction to fear. It's a reaction to our own internalized and undiscussed harms that happen to us. None of those are excuses; they're factors. But I think, that there is a moment. We are talking about this far more than a couple of decades before. The mechanisms we've put in place in schools, workplaces, and sporting spaces, et cetera, are much more advanced than before. Um, Access to information about it, if you think of stories a few decades back of how rape and sexual assault and certain forms of violence were talked about, the silence in homes of not questioning what happened, between a man and a wife in a heterosexual relationship where, police were scant to intervene. We've had a massive sea change. We're by no means there, but I think our antennas are up. And I think it's a really crucial moment to me of whether we take this toward just we call out acts of harm, or can we look upstream? And I think, to think of where no pressure on you, the younger generation, but yeah, there's a bit of pressure. Like, how can we take this upstream? There is, the power of Me Too and what that has meant in the US and globally. Like, we are paying attention now in really, really important ways. Not nearly as much as we still need to, but that's changed significantly. How can we think now of where we have to do less calling out and more calling in to not having to use all of our mechanisms, to really bringing the incidence of gender-based violence down? It is by, unquestionably an advancement in the world that more women feel empowered to speak out and get help and support when they do. And somewhat, not quite as much for boys and men who are survivors of sexual violence, for example. And as fantastic as that is, as an important advance, I think meaningful prevention that really brings us into aspirational and caring manhood has got a lot to do still. And that's where I'm excited, where there are conversations like this one with younger generations having them and defining what that can be. So if I hope that some of our activism has helped get to that space so we can say, my generation brought a lot of harm to the table. And I think there's also a lot of voices that brought some attention to the table on the topic. How can we now work together, but really empowering your voices to say, beyond just calling out harm, we can actually remake manhood and build on the best of it. At least I'd like to think that. Is that a lot to ask?
We're on it. But I love what you're saying about the shift to upstream factors, because one of my frustrations is when you're working on changing just the individual, just the kid in school, that you might make an impact, but then they're returning to a family system, they're returning to an institution, they're returning to a school, they're returning to their phones that's, shaped by all these social norms and, whatever is going on in the world. And so it's really more of a collective responsibility and a collective problem rather than, just an individual one. So that was one thought I had as you were talking. And then the other question that sort of came up is around calling people in. And I'm curious, from the conversations at the convening that you just held, or maybe through your research, if you've seen any inspiring ways that people have transformed and, successfully been able to call folks in.
Yeah, good. I was thinking about some of the conversations that I, was allowed to have on stage, and really fun with some young men rappers, one from the UK, one from Brazil, who and a poet that you may have seen on stage as well. Just very open about what Ryan was talking about before, about their own mental health challenges and vulnerabilities. And just making a safe space that men could say, and could also talk about harm that they had witnessed. And so, if I think those were crowded rooms with microphones and cameras on, and, lots of folks willing to talk about suicide attempts, challenges they had had with their own fathers or other people in their family, that, stuff that used to stay in the space of taboo, I think is exciting that we've, while we're looking against, clavicular and fill in the blanks of all the, the harm that comes down the algorithms, there's also public facing known men willing to talk about this, athletes as well. There's certainly Alex, some of the folks that we know who come out of the athletic space working on this. Really, exciting that we do have more space and bravery to talk about it. And I think that's, that is far more powerful than me saying men should talk about this. To have, men that other men look up to saying this is what it means to talk about it and talk about it openly. And I think the other part that we're excited about as an organization, and Alex, you mentioned our Men Care initiative, is that, what our research has just shown over the years, the bad news is that as we look at the rates of men's violence against women, they really have not come down in the last decade, if not the last 2 decades. For all the noise we're making, it looks like we're really not pushing the numbers there. Women are more likely to report, which is fantastic. We're more likely to hold men accountable. The good news in the gender story is that more men are defining their happiness and their identity as being caregivers and fathers. So we've got this opportunity to say, if this is the best of manhood, how can we sort of turn up the volume on this? And how can we step into that energy? We also do know that when men do more hands-on caregiving, there tends to be less forms of family violence. I mean, obviously that's bidirectional, and that's not causality by itself, but it does seem to work in terms of if we call men in and model what nurturing behavior looks like without having to say, don't use violence. Nurture kind of takes over. It creates its own self-reinforcing loop that men can see what their relationships with their children are like, what their relationships with their partners are like. So we're leaning a lot into that topic. And I would say the other one is around parent training, father training in particular, as a space to say, if given a chance, men are far more likely to lean into care than to lean away from it. Not sure, Lucy, if that answered your question.
Yeah. And it also kind of makes me think of some of my restorative justice work with folks who've caused harm in intimate relationships and within sexual violence, and how one of the most powerful things that I've seen as a circle keeper is that almost across the board, across all the people I've worked with, there's sort of that process of relationship building, responsibility, and respect building in which care for the core person emerges. And that process of care, receiving that care, taking it in, and then being able to show that empathy, to show that care to someone else, has sort of been one of the secret ingredients that I've seen across a variety of different ages, walks of life. And so I really love how simple it sounds with the word care, because it distills this process that I've kind of been sitting with of like, how do we describe this magic of what's happening in people's transformation? So it just resonates a lot with me.
Yeah. And Lucy, I'll just pick up on that. So, have done work both with trauma support for individuals in conflict settings who've witnessed, horrendous violence, and then work with male perpetrators, including in Brazil. We helped start some of the first work with perpetrators. And as hard as it was to get beyond, the anger that we feel there as therapists, group facilitators, et cetera, toward men who have caused harm, it is creating a caring environment for them. That is what generates the possibility for change in them. And as much as I may have said, and you're doing your PhD in this work and likewise studying it and saying, I know this is true. There's plenty of other folks who have written it. When it's practiced by others who went in with skepticism about that approach. So I'm very proud that in the state of Rio, it is the justice sector system, the penitentiary system, that carries out perpetrator groups and getting them to look at men that they often look at in racist and classist ways, and that they had reason to hold accountable for harm that they carried out, but to say, they kind of, and I think you said it really thoughtfully, Lucy, around it's kind of this caring human emerges. As I've made that possible for them and held space for them to not be, as Brian Stevenson said, I should be seen as more than the worst thing I've ever done. I think that's such an important phrasing and look at men who have carried out harm, women too, that we basically said there is still a caring human in there, and we will hold you accountable for some of the worst things you've done, but we believe there is so much more to you than the worst you've ever done.
Building off of that, you mentioned earlier, clavicular and kind of the negative influences that young men have right now. And I was wondering how you try to reach those men who maybe resent the idea of talking about gender equality.
Yeah. I mean, I think we've spent a lot of time doing, AI assisted research and a lot of listening to young men about, kind of how they take in messages online. Um, we need to be concerned about, how the algorithms work, right? We know that very important study out of researchers in Ireland who basically said if you sign up on YouTube and put your profile as a 15-year-old boy and you just kind of plug in sports stuff, within 23 minutes on average, some misogyny will come to you. But I think it's important to say and most young men are not going online looking for misogyny. They're looking to have fun, connect with others like them, plug in questions about what is good sex? How do I get somebody to like me? How do I look cool? How much water to drink? How many ounces of protein do I need a day? A lot of that is all just either, it's just like harmless. It's just normal stuff. I think we've got to hold accountable those who are, feeding the harm and the craziness and think about what we've done that we've not created a safe space that says, we get it. It's confusing about what it means to be men now. It's not what it was before. There's a lot of men who feel economically precarious stepping into the world. A lot of guys are not doing well in school. We've got to be generous enough that we can see that and see that some young men are struggling. It doesn't mean we don't look at, the needs of women anymore. We can do 2, 3 things at the same time. So I think I can't really do much about clavicular. What I can do is to say, what have we done on the more progressive sides that we've let that space be taken over by the worst? And there are lots of positive influencers online. It's one of the things that we're doing is providing funding and opportunities. Lucy, you saw some of them do their spoken word stuff in Rio, like provide opportunities that say, you may not have as many followers as Clavicular, but you got 20K today. And, if we can support you and get you, more opportunities next week, maybe we're talking 40K and then you're up to 200K. And, there's a lot of opportunities to fill in the mindlessness, to call it that, of the algorithm. But we've also got to call out, right, the systems, of profit-making platforms who profit on, trafficking in the worst. But I don't think, even as we need to do all kinds of controls on it, we're all gonna go on as adults at some point, right? Or as 16-year-olds or 15-year-olds. So we've also gotta lean into the good stuff that's there. So I kind of wanna make sure that there's not like one single story about Clavicular, Joe Rogan. We can fill in the blank with lots of really cool guys who are filling in the space, rappers and influencers and content producers online who wanna be seen, and we need to help them sort of cut through the noise.
Thank you for that. I really respect the way that you have such dialectical belief holding, that you can think in this way where you say we need to hold these people accountable, but also we need to do these steps to um, allow them to get the help that they deserve. And so I just really respect your viewpoint there.
Thanks.
And that's what aspirational masculinity, I think, is so powerful and so beautiful, Sylvie, because it can hold
Yeah.
and it has to hold, all those different things too. So I think, convening conversations like this is so important because we get that chance to kind of talk about those complexities and what it looks like from so many different vantage points too.
Yeah.
Yeah, and we're coming close to the end of our time, and we might have to have you back on again, Gary, to talk about the whole ecosystem that needs to be addressed and the ecosystem that needs to be built,
Yeah.
because there are a lot of structural impediments, and there are a lot of industries and a lot of money flows and such. But if that is happening in certain spaces, it means, it could be happening in others. And, how do we attack that? And, you know, again, so grateful for the work that you and Equimundo, are doing, because providing, the data, the research for, um, for us to be better equipped to discuss these problems and address them. And, you know, uh, I think all of us have seen and witnessed, you know, the issues of institutional betrayal or institutional complicity.
Yeah.
Um, and I do think those things need to be called out. And, thank goodness there are people working on, alternatives. So very, grateful for your work, Gary. So thank you. At the end of each one of our episodes, Gary, we ask our guest to, create their own "I have the right to" statement to leave, with the audience. So in the tradition of the Aspire podcast, would love to say, what is the Gary Barker "I have the right to" statement to inspire, our audience?
Yeah, multiple ways I could. That's a great question. Let me just say that. I have the right to be deeply tender and caring, and to lead with that.
And still be the greatest and best man possible. That is, I'd love, that picture. And to me, that is a real man, right?
Yeah,
And, again, using your focal point word, caring. And, um, for our audience, I would encourage you to check out Equimundo and the work that they are doing. Um, the work of developing and building care with men. It sounds so obvious, so simple, yet it is such a complex,
yeah.
issue with so much baggage that we need to address. And Gary, thank you for addressing that, and thank you for coming onto our podcast today.
Thanks, and thanks for all that you do. And I have a right to. I think the speaking out and leaning in with aspirational manhood really is the way forward. And I think fewer guys of our generation, Alex, and more of Sylvie and Ryan's generation leading the charge. So I feel honored to be in the conversation, and pleased to continue to find ways that we can partner.
Well, and Lucy, this was a real pleasure doing my first podcast with you, and hopefully it's not the last. And I'm so grateful that you could do it, especially after attending that wonderful conference in Brazil that Gary hosted. And Sylvie and Ryan, thank you so much for your courage and using your voice to bring about positive change. And you are the reason why I have great hope for what is in front of us. Thank you so much for listening. Like and subscribe to the podcast on all platforms. And if you enjoyed today's episode, please give us a 5-star rating and tell your friends about Aspire. Follow us on social media at I Have the Right To. Learn more about our student and executive programming at our website at ihavetherightto.org.